if you look at the CDC will show you that about 54% of suicides had no diagnosable mental illness. So where does that number come from? It largely comes from these psychological autopsies.
Before we dive in, it's important to remember that the information we provide is for informational purposes only. Every situation is unique, and decisions regarding your health or legal matters should be made after consulting with your own doctor or lawyer. Our aim is to inform and empower, but personal circumstances require personalized advice. Hi, welcome to another edition of Justice in Scrubs. I'm attorney Richard Hastings, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Jeff Michaelis.
And today we have a fascinating guest in Dr. Charles Herrick, who is a psychiatrist.
Yes.
And he is going to talk about a number of different issues. Thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start with what got you into the field of psychiatry?
Well, the short answer is my father was a psychiatrist and my mother was a psychiatric nurse, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's the short answer. The long answer is I hated medicine. Actually, that's even shorter. No, I just enjoyed I enjoyed the humanities, philosophy, and history and psychology. So it was a good fit.
So for those of the people watching that are not certain about this, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor.
Yes.
As opposed to a psychologist who has a PhD.
Correct.
And what are the most common types of individuals you see in your practice?
Well, I've seen a variety of individuals over my years of practice. So I started out as an outpatient psychiatrist. So you see kind of the walking wounded when you're treating them. And then I moved to Jacoby Medical Center, which is a city hospital. And there you treat actually a lot more seriously mentally ill patients. I worked on an inpatient unit for several years, and then I worked in what is known as a CPEP, which is a comprehensive psychiatric emergency program that the New York hospitals support. So it's really a emergency department dedicated to psychiatric emergencies. So I did that for a few years, and then I came to Danbury, Connecticut, and I worked as a consultation psychiatrist in the hospital, seeing the medically or surgically ill who had psychiatric problems and needed consultations. And now more currently, I do mostly outpatient practice, and I'm the program director for our residency training program, and I do administrative work. I'm the network chair for the 7 hospitals in New Vance.
So before you got here this morning, Jeff and I were talking about the fact that when we were kids, I don't remember anyone going to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or get any type of counseling. I mean, it just did not happen. And then all of a sudden you get to, present day when it seems like every third person is seeing a mental health professional. Why is that the case?
That's a very good question. And there are many opinions about why this is the case. I think one of the major ideas behind it is destigmatization, that there was a stigma attached to seeing psychiatrists and psychotherapists over the years, and that has been reduced significantly. There's another opinion that the idea that the DSM has been able to identify more psychiatric conditions.
Can you explain what DSM is?
Yeah, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's basically the diagnostic catalog for psychiatry. So that has expanded over the years, and so more and more conditions that are appropriate for treatment are being identified. And then there's other opinions such as diagnostic creep, which means how we diagnose depression has expanded over the years. And so a lot of people who previously were not included in that category are now being included in that category. So there's that. And then, finally, I think a lot more people are coming out and talking about their mental health challenges and their mental illness, particularly celebrities. When celebrities do that, it makes it more acceptable, not only acceptable, but even perhaps people want to do that. Just like any sort of product endorsement, they're endorsing psychotherapy and psychopharmacological medications. And so people, like any product, want it.
Mm-hmm.
Is it because the medicines are better than they used to be?
No. The medicines are different. The efficacy, in other words, their ability to treat the condition hasn't changed for 75 years since they were first introduced. What has changed is they're safer, they're easier to administer, they have fewer side effects. So for all those reasons, they're better tolerated and their use has expanded. Remember, these conditions are not black and white. It's not categorical differences. Biology doesn't think categorically. We do. Biology is always on a continuum. And where you draw the line and define normality versus psychopathology is largely cultural. It's largely societal. It's largely the community. So, where we drew the line 50 years ago is not where we draw the line today. The medications don't make distinctions based on that. And there are many, many studies that show that these medications can improve, for example, social functioning in anyone, independent of whether or not they have a diagnosable mental illness. There is lots of research that shows that lithium has antisuicidal properties independent of its efficacy in treating severe manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder. So the medications work regardless of where we draw that line.
Let me ask you a question about depression. So depression is huge. And I'm assuming that somebody does not come into your office, you ask them 10 questions, and then you say, you're depressed. So for somebody listening, what's the difference between going through your day and feeling out of sorts, so to speak, and somebody that has full-blown depression? When should you be concerned about what thoughts are driving your behavior?
So, and here's where, medications have changed the way we consider the diagnosis of depression. In the past, we had what were known as tricyclic antidepressant medications, and they were used primarily for people whose depression was so severe that they needed hospitalization. In other words, they couldn't get out of bed, they couldn't function, they had no ability to care for themselves. They had suicidal thoughts of such severity and intensity that they couldn't let go of them, they couldn't move forward, that independent of any sort of change in their environment, whether it's social or whether it's physical, wouldn't have an impact on the way they felt about themselves. And in those conditions, hospitalization was absolutely necessary for them in order for them to really survive. And medications were incredibly useful in treating them. When the SSRIs were introduced in the mid-'80s, most of the research at that time showed that they were good for the ambulatory depressed patient. In other words, the walking wounded, like I had talked about with you earlier. These patients, they have some degree of the categorical symptoms that we use to diagnose depression, which is 2 weeks of feeling down or in the dumps or loss of interest associated with both cognitive problems such as feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, inability to focus or concentrate, as well as what we call neurovegetative symptoms, which are more physical symptoms, loss of energy, loss of libido, inability to really function in any sort of capacity, problems with sleep or appetite, weight loss. Now, because it can be any 5 of 8 of these, so it's sort of mix and match like a Chinese menu, You can diagnose depression for anyone who has any 5 or 8 of these over a 2-week period of time. The other thing that happened historically was there were ideas that these depressions, the serious depressions, were what they considered to be inherent to the individual. It was a biological thing that just sprung out. And while obviously there were triggers to the symptoms essentially existed independently. They removed, and they called any depression that was a result of a clearly identified trigger, such as death, divorce, loss of a spouse, financial loss, bereavement. They were not considered to be depressions. If they were, they called them reactive depressions or adjustment disorders, something that was modifiable by the environment. And in those situations, the individual could feel better in some settings and feel worse in other settings. And so medication really wasn't considered to be effective because we basically just relied on the tricyclic antidepressants. When the SSRI came on board, we started to treat this population with these medications because they were safe. They could be used easily. The side effect profile was low risk. You can overdose or die on them. And so they were used more extensively in a broader population of patients that had in the past what we called reactive depressions. The DSM removed that whole category of, not caused by these various situations. When they did that, the number of conditions labeled as major depressive disorder increased dramatically. The medications were effective independent of whether or not people had what we in the past called melancholic depressions, or those serious depressions that were incapacitating or seriously suicidal. So I think that's sort of what has changed. These medications are very effective anti-anxiety medications. In fact, they're more effective treating anxiety than they are in treating depression. But a lot of depression and a lot of the more serious symptoms associated with depression are anxious symptoms. Most of the distress that people experience in terms of their mood is from anxiety. And anxiety is really the driving force behind a lot of the suicidal feelings, because when you're feeling anxious, and we've all felt a sense of anxiety or dread, but when it becomes so severe that it's incapacitating or you can't identify what is going on, you begin to feel like you're losing your mind, and you're going to start feeling like I'd be better off dead than having these feelings. And that's where the medications are incredibly effective. And that's, again, it really is the categories of symptoms that we use to treat these, to identify these conditions and treat them are really kind of, there's science behind it, but it's oftentimes in the clinical setting, you kind of throw that out the window and you look at the patient's level of distress and you make a decision based on, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, rather than is this something that's situational or is this something that's internal?
So I think for somebody listening who might be experiencing 2 weeks or more of these types of feelings, very despondent, very anxious, they have trouble getting out of bed, they have trouble functioning, they're losing weight. The message I'm hearing is that there is great hope for you.
Absolutely.
And there are things that you can do, for example, these SSRIs, you can take, and they don't really affect you on a day-to-day basis in a negative way, but they can give you kind of the strength or the hope or the kind of the bump in your step so you can get through the day and not experience these lows.
Yeah. And here's the challenge, and this is where the medications they're a tool. But they have some downsides to them, like any tool. So I have patients, for example, who, because of that severe anxiety, it dampens those emotional experiences. But unfortunately, it can dampen all emotional experiences. So patients will come back to me and they will say to me, I go to the movies and I enjoy the movies. They create great emotion in me, whether it's laughter or tears. And I notice now that I'm on these medications, I'm not experiencing that as much. I'm like, yeah, that's funny, but, okay, so what? Or, one of the biggest side effects associated with them is loss of libido, delayed ejaculation, anorgasmia. And if you think about it from a physiological standpoint, it makes sense because basically you're dampening your sensory inputs, all of your sensory inputs. And that's a good thing if you're overly distressed by all the sensory inputs that are coming into your body that are making you feel distressed. But it's also a bad thing because you're not experiencing the positive emotions often that are associated with that. So it's a balance, and it really has to be appreciated by the patient that that's a possible problem associated with the medication. And sometimes you can titrate the medicine up and down, but sometimes patients will come to me and say, you know what, I can't tolerate it. I'd rather have these feelings because I miss the positive feelings associated with it.
Well, you talked about two different categories. You talked about people that are biologically depressed, and then you talked about people who are reactive depression, whatever you want to call it. So biologically depressed patients probably need to be on this forever, but patients that are reacting to a bad thing might only need to be on it for a short period of time. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So the rule of thumb in psychiatry is usually one episode of depression buys you a year on medication, 2 episodes, 2 years, and 3 or more episodes indefinitely. I don't believe that's the case. I think it's much more individualized. And again, the distinction between sort of reactive and biological is rather arbitrary and, again, on a continuum. So it often requires a combination of psychotherapy as well as medication management. But I would agree, my practice is to get medications down to their lowest level or off the patient as soon as they're feeling better and they're able to get back to their usual way of feeling and acting, and also letting them know, the possibility does exist that these could return. And I have patients where I titrate the medicines. I increase the medicines. I said, we know you're anticipating going into a very stressful set of circumstances. Let's increase the dose. Things are really in a good place for you now. Let's decrease the dose, if not get you off them. But not to stand in these kind of rigid ideas about you're on the medicine or you're off the medicine, or you're on this dose or you're not on medicine. I think it's really a matter of art in terms of working with the patient and identifying what the circumstances are that are driving the symptoms.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And it's so important to be individualistic in addressing these things, not just have I do it this way and I do that way. It can change all the time, right?
Exactly.
And also having your experience is very important too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things when you were mentioning the biological depression, I think of the Hemingway family,
yes.
Ernest Hemingway. And I think his father committed suicide. He committed suicide. I think one of his sons committed suicide. Perhaps a sibling committed suicide. I mean, there was a lot of suicide in that family. And is that something, in your opinion, that's related to some chemical imbalance within the person, or is that a behavior that others kind of see and then maybe think of as a way out? Or how does that work in your mind, if you know?
I think suicidality, which is, our biggest issue in psychiatry currently, is a very, very difficult and tricky symptom. Because if you think about it, suicidality doesn't exist in the animal kingdom, but there are many animal models of depression and psychosis and other kinds of conditions. So suicidality really is in many ways an emergent kind of experience, which means that a lot of things come into play that ultimately lead to a conscious decision or choice that life isn't worth living anymore. How those factors come into play are so amorphous. They could be internal biological factors. They could be external factors. We know, for example, shame is probably one of the biggest drivers for suicide in men. Much more, we talk about in depression, guilt. Guilt is an individual experience. You're measuring yourself against your own expectations of what you ought to be doing. Shame, however, is a social experience. And if you think about how we evolved as a species, we evolved in groups. And groups mean that you need to have a face so that you can connect with the group. When you lose that face, you're dead. Which is why social anxiety is so critical to trying to manage effectively, why public speaking is often identified as a much greater fear than the fear of death. Because in our evolutionary past, if you're shamed, you're effectively dead because you're thrown out of the community. So shame is a big driver in suicidality, particularly for men. And what are the driving forces of shame? Social loss, economic loss, loss of power. And you will see that, we don't worry about married men becoming suicidal as much as we worried about recently divorced men. Because they've lost, in many ways, their only social connection, because men are rather solo and independent, and their connections largely are from work and from their family. And that really is it. So when they lose those connections, their suicidality becomes an incredibly high risk. And that's why it's not a one-size-fits-all. The other problem is we often associate mental illness as the driving force. And if you look at the American Society of Suicidology, and everybody says 80% of patients who suicide had a mental illness. And I think that is, if you look at the CDC will show you that about 54% of suicides had no diagnosable mental illness. So where does that number come from? It largely comes from these psychological autopsies, which are driven by our cognitive confirmation bias. So if somebody suicides, they must have had a mental illness. I think that makes us feel better, like, oh, good, I'm not mentally ill, so that's not going to happen to me. But I think what it also does, it's really a problem, is that it says it's a mental health problem, but it's not. It's a public health problem. A public health problem means when you think about public health, what are the factors that improve health in the public? They aren't medicine as much as they are clean water, clean air.
Diet.
Yeah. A sewage system that operates effectively, which reduces cholera. If you look at historical drops in tuberculosis, by way of example, what you will see is a huge drop over hundreds and hundreds of years in the diagnosis of tuberculosis, and then the implementation of antituberculants is at the tail end when TB is already dropping. Well, that's largely a public health response. Suicide needs to be treated as a public health problem and addressed with a public health solution. Minting more mental health providers to treat suicidal patients is not the answer. It's too late by then. So, that's really my issue with suicidality, that you can't associate it specifically with a mental illness, because even, the largest rates of suicide are the mentally ill, right? So how good have we been in treating and preventing suicide among our treatments of the mentally ill? It's debatable. The jury's out. The literature doesn't necessarily support that mental health care, except in very limited circumstances, effectively prevents suicide. there are only two medications that are known to treat suicide. Lithium, and that's irrespective of diagnosis, and Clozaril, which is specific for patients with schizophrenia disorders and schizoaffective disorders. Those are known to reduce suicide. No other medication does that. You know, when you think about what are the effective public health measures. So Switzerland, by way of example, which is a very libertarian society, they have mandatory conscription. And they used to allow their troops, when they left service, to have a choice between keeping or giving up their firearm. They decided, after seeing a number of significant suicides and the rates of suicide growing, that they weren't going to give those troops that choice anymore. You had to turn in your gun. Suicide rates in Switzerland dropped up to 17%, just by that effective measure. That's a public health response to the problem. That's what I'm talking about. If I, as a psychiatrist, were able to develop a drug that reduced suicide by 17% or 7%, I would win the Nobel Prize. But employing a public health strategy where's the incentive? It doesn't exist.
We wanted to take a quick break to remind you about our sponsor, findagreatattorney.com. Dealing with the aftermath of an accident or injury can be overwhelming. And the last thing you want to worry about is finding the right lawyer. Findagreatattorney.com simplifies the process by connecting you with one of the top attorneys in your area who specializes in your specific type of case. Whether you've been injured in a car accident, suffered a slip and fall, or experienced medical malpractice, findagreatattorney.com has a network of experienced lawyers ready to help. And remember, their service is completely free, so you can focus on your recovery without worrying about the cost of legal representation. If you or someone you know needs legal assistance, don't hesitate to visit findagreatattorney.com and let them match you with one of the best lawyers in your area for your needs.
Speaking of suicide, there was a period of time, and I'm not sure it's true now, when teenagers were given SSRIs and increased the suicide rate.
Yes.
Why don't I just stop you for those of the people listening that don't know. What is an SSRI?
That's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is the chemical property of the antidepressant that's associated with it. It's a bit of a misnomer because these drugs have multiple chemical effects, not just on serotonin, but they also affect dopamine, they affect norepinephrine, they affect histamine, they affect a lot of different areas. So they're called SSRIs as a marketing idea. They're called antidepressants as a marketing idea, but they're basically drugs. And by the way, the whole term drug is equally loaded, right? If I say drug, oh man, that has abuse potential. But if I use medication, oh, then it's safe. But they're all drugs. Let's make no mistake. These are all chemicals or drugs that we ingest. And they, like any chemical or drug, they have positive and they have negative effects. So when you speak to the idea about young adults having an increase in suicidality, again, that's a downstream effect. So the question is, there may be underlying reasons. Kids tend to be much more sensitive to the side effects of these medications initially. These medications, because they cause a surge of serotonin, and a surge of serotonin can actually initially have the opposite effect on us. It can make us feel jittery. We can have insomnia. We can have nausea or diarrhea. That, if not properly explained to patients in the beginning, oh, if you have these symptoms, it's probably the medication. Give me a call. Let's do something about it. They may think, I'm going crazy. I'm getting worse. I'm hopeless. I might as well kill myself. So that's what I mean also by suicidality having a downstream effect. The unfortunate aspect is that the FDA then slaps that black box warning on anything that's identified as an antidepressant. So even an anticonvulsant, if it's used as an antidepressant, will say it has a boxed warning, even though there's no evidence to support it. So there are lots of kind of weird things that happen as soon as a drug is called something for the purposes of marketing or research or whatever, regardless of what its actual properties are.
So you were talking earlier about these episodic events that cause us to experience Great Depression. And I wanted to switch to another area now where you were kind of in the eye of the storm for this, and that is Sandy Hook. And for those of you watching, we are very closely in proximity to Sandy Hook, where the horrific school shooting occurred, I think probably 13, 14 years ago.
12.
And you were involved in that as a mental health professional. Could you talk about that for a little bit, if you would, please?
Sure. So I first learned about it from my wife, who texted me that morning. We were actually in a leadership meeting for the hospital at that time. And my wife takes our kids to St. Rose, where they attended school, and she sees all these ambulance and police cars barreling down Church Street toward the school. And she texts me, "You must know something. What's going on here?" I had no clue. And then suddenly I see everybody standing up and huddling, and then the news breaks that there's been a school shooting. So we immediately began to set things up to figure out, what is going on and how we can help. Obviously, the surgeons got involved. The intensivists got involved. Everybody geared up for what they thought was going to be a pretty significant trauma situation where they would have to treat a large number of patients. Fortunately, the opposite happened. Only 2 patients came in who survived. And as everybody knows, 26 people died in that, and not including the shooter and the shooter's mother. We immediately were at the firehouse where everybody had been stationed on that day to learn about what had happened. And then we met with state officials, school officials, and we set up a site at the Reed Middle School, which is part of the Sandy Hook school system up the street. And we began a system of basically publicizing to the community that we were ready and available to see them, to treat them, to hear their concerns, to address their needs psychologically, emotionally, even physically. And it was a weird scenario because none of us had ever experienced anything like this before, and we didn't know what we were doing. And we had hooked up with many of the community members like Family and Children's Aid and Wellmore and all these other nonprofit mental health organizations who were just incredibly, everybody really came together. And I remember the first morning that we organized and opened things up, I was afraid we were going to be inundated with the community and not have enough supports to meet their needs. So we were letting, everybody in, counselors, priests, ministers, just everybody. And then quickly came to realize we were being inundated by offers to help and that we needed to actually begin to limit them as well. And so we started saying you need a Connecticut license in order to be part of this support service. So, I remember that morning I was talking to a guy named Irv Phillips, who's the head of child and adolescent psychiatry at Family and Children's Aid. And I said, Irv, do you know anybody who has a playbook on how to manage disasters? He said, oh, yeah, I call him. He's at Harvard. He's here this morning. You want to talk to him? And I said, absolutely. Let me talk to him. So I go to him and I said, so what's the playbook? And he pulls out this huge text. It's probably over 1,000 pages. He goes, here it is. I said, that is not helpful. But you learn on the job how to organize and how to meet the needs of the community. And at that time, the president of the Connecticut Psychiatric Association, a guy, John Santo Pietro, who's the VP of behavioral health at Harvard Healthcare, was calling me, and he would call me every morning. How many people do you need, Chuck? And I would tell him. We would start counting, and he would send them over, and so we were able to organize and treat. And we were there a month, 6 weeks. We definitely were. We were there 12 hours a day through the holidays and 7 days a week, and then as things improved a little bit, the schools were struggling with deciding whether or not they would open classes again, so there was a lot of decision making on the fly by the state and everybody in terms of what is the best way to meet the needs of the community and the kids, and because we'd never experienced anything like this before, it was all new.
What do you say to these family members?
You can't say anything.
Right.
You can't say anything that at that point is at all helpful. I would say that the biggest emotion that I experienced was anger. And the irony was we had really cordoned off the area from everybody, the press, the police. I mean, you were not getting into this site. And then every night I'd go home and I'd watch the news. And of course, it was all Sandy Hook, and they would be interviewing all these mental health providers. And it was almost surreal. Are they talking about Sandy Hook, or is there a parallel Sandy Hook that they're talking about? Because I have no experience with people. I have no idea who these people are or it was just a weird thing in terms of being at the epicenter, and yet by being very careful about maintaining privacy and anonymity, as a result, there's this other reality that grows in the news that is completely separated from what you're experiencing.
My daughters were home from college and they worked at Ethan Allen during the break. And there were a lot of reporters staying at Ethan Allen. And it was disgusting what was going on there about the reporters. If you know anyone, here's my card, call me. And my daughters were just aghast at how all they were concerned about was getting some kind of news story.
Right.
And it was nothing about the families.
Right. And the families wanted their privacy. And I, when I told you I was recently interviewed from a journalist at Hearst Papers, it's like, so how are the families? That's always the question, how are the families? And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It's like Tolstoy's first sentence from Anna Karenina. All unhappy families are different, and all happy families are alike. To paraphrase, and I think everybody goes through the pain of loss differently, and their recovery is equally different compared to people who are happy. And so I can't really speak to the families. I can't even begin to imagine the feelings that they went through.
So what lessons have you learned from working with these families affected by the Sandy Hook disaster?
So I did not work directly with the families. They were treated by their own individual providers. Again, I think the lesson I learned was not to have any expectations and there's no timeline to recovery, just for any loss, but in particular a loss like this. And that no matter what you do, you're going to be criticized. You just can't begin to fill the hole that is there. And sometimes any attempt to fill that hole actually leads to more pain and grief than it actually resolves. So it's very, very difficult.
What advice would you have for someone that's going through something incredibly traumatic like that or suffering a very grievous loss?
So I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, there are mental health providers and out there who can be helpful, but I would be very wary of initially reaching out to professionals because I think this is such a personal experience. It demands a personal touch, and most mental health professionals are professionals. They're not personal. So, family, friends, loved ones are the people you need during this period of time, not necessarily some mental health professional.
And I deal in my practice with a lot of death. And I seem to hear the same thing from people that have experienced the loss of a loved one. And that is people, friends, very well-meaning friends and family members come to them and give them suggestions or advice. And I think a lot of people resent that because unless you've been through it, you have no idea. And there's no real life cycle of in X number of weeks or months, you should feel X and you should feel Y at this point. It's so personal, like you said, that whatever you're feeling is what you have to deal with. And then if you need to speak with somebody or perhaps, get some type of medication, that you do that. But it's such a wildly personal experience that, somebody should not say to you, well, you should start moving your child's, clothing out of the closet now. It's been 6 months.
No, and, I think the challenge for any loss, to be honest, like that is you're in a lot of pain. But you want the pain to go away, but also if the pain goes away, then you feel like you've betrayed the person that you're grieving. So you're caught really between being in terrible pain and feeling like you've betrayed your loved one. So how do you navigate that? I don't think you can.
And I think, especially in the anger like you would have at Sandy Hook, I think for somebody to try to say to them, you have to let it go, you have to let it go, you have to let it go, I think certain people have to hold on to that for some period of time until they feel like they're ready to start letting go of some of that.
I mean, when you're angry and somebody approaches you with that, I think your first feeling is you want to punch them. And that's a natural feeling. I would. So, I think you have to recognize that fact.
Speaking of wanting to punch someone, how about these Sandy Hook deniers, the InfoWars, and all these people? How did that impact the family, and did it impact the families?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what ultimately led to the lawsuits, justifiably so, both against the gun manufacturers as well as against Jones. So I don't think there are too many people in the community who feel any sympathy for that. And here's the problem is that gets categorized as sort of a conspiracy theory. So any conspiracy theory then becomes associated with it. It's one among many. So then the people who promulgate any conspiracy theory, which has grown, including January 6th, the people who promulgate these conspiracy theories ultimately get captured in a group of conspiracy theorists. So you can't help but have, if you believe in this conspiracy theory, then you probably believe in that one, and you're just one of, that group. And so, when you think about the politics today that leading up to the election and all of the news reports on conspiracy theories, I think that actually adds to the pain in some ways.
Let's talk about what families can do to alleviate or tamp down or assist their children with potential challenges that they're having. And I attended a seminar, and the person giving it was a psychiatrist, and said one of the worst things that we have today is social media, where you go on Facebook and you see all these people enjoying wonderful meals and wonderful vacations and going sporting events, and people that don't do those things are kind of taken aback and feel less than. So what are some things that you could suggest to parents?
So social media is an accelerant. There's a recent book by a social psychologist on the anxious generation. In many ways, that group is the group that are many of the kids who attended Sandy Hook at the time of the shooting. I think it would be, I'm sure that many of them feel reluctant or are careful about sharing their background because of the associations with that on social media. I don't participate in social media. I just read the research on social media, and everything that I read about social media is difficult. My kids are in that generation. My kids are 24 and 26. They use social media because every kid does. I think parents need to be much more inquisitive about their social media use. I don't think, as soon as you tell a kid you can't do that or I'm not letting you do that, forget it. I mean, you've lost. So you need to approach it conversationally and supportively. I'll tell you a story. So when my daughter was in high school or late middle school, she received a rather troubling picture from a boy.
Ugh.
And my daughter brought it to my wife's attention. And my wife, who had a history of working on Wall Street and had also suffered her own traumas growing up as a kid, told my daughter, here's how you manage it. And, she basically texted the boy back, are you trying to impress me? Because you're not, and and the boy immediately, so basically she shamed him. And the boy, immediately said, oh, sorry, it wasn't meant for you or whatever. And it never happened again. And I think many times parents, they want to get angry and they want to go talk to the other parent and they want to intervene in some way, which sometimes can have the opposite effect on the kid. It can be more traumatizing because they look at the parent as a role model for how to act and think and feel. Mm-hmm. And if they see the parent is traumatized, they're going to become traumatized.
Is that why they went to their mother?
Yeah, because my wife is not like that.
I wouldn't have handled that very well.
Yeah, most of us wouldn't. But, that's why I say my wife worked on Wall Street, so she was subject to a lot of that sort of behavior down there. And basically her attitude was you just got to kick them in the balls. And I think it allowed my kids to be able to manage, difficult situations more effectively as a result of that. And that's exactly the opposite of what's happening with many of the kids today. They don't know how to handle that. In Haidt's book on the anxious generation, he talks about two features that have led to the distress of mental health problems, the growing problem in that generation. And the first one is what he called safetyism, but a lot of psychologists I've read previously on what they call dangerism, which is basically a fear that your kid is going to be kidnapped, or that bad things are going to happen if you don't properly supervise the kid. So the kids basically lost the opportunity to grow independently and to meet with other kids socially and develop relationships that allowed physical contact, social and emotional contact, working out conflicts, the stuff that we experienced when our parents said, get out of the house and don't come back till dinner, Right. So because of the, here a kid is kidnapped and raped and strangled, parents suddenly, as a national phenomenon, begin protecting their kids by bringing them in and not allowing them that level of independence. The other part of that was the growing child protective services. So parents were also not only fearful of their kid getting harmed, but of being accused of being negligent. And some of the laws really were restrictive, and parents have wrongly been accused of something that they thought was good for the kid, but was viewed by others as negligent. So they're afraid of being called. Somebody calling CPS saying, here's a kid out there independently behaving, and the parent getting accused of that. So the parents bring their kids in, and then that came on the rise of the internet and video games and social media, and there was the opportunity for the kids to spend more time on these sorts of things, where the interaction, the social interaction that happens, is not the same as physical social interaction on the playground. So you can, if you don't like something, you can drop out of it immediately. So there's no opportunity to work out differences. You're just done. And then the other part of that is what you described earlier, where everything is just rosy. So they present a very rosy image of their lives, which makes the kids feel bad. I mean, my daughters got upset when they discovered that part of their friend group had a get-together, a party, and she wasn't invited. But she saw it on social media. It was very distressing. So those are things that are really, really a challenge for us now, because it's out there. The cat is out of the bag, so to speak. So how do you manage it safely and effectively? And you can't do it just by banning it.
So one of the things I heard, which they talked about in school when my kids were in high school, they're much older now, but they said the number one way that you can keep your kids off drugs, stop them from drinking and know what's going on in their life, is to have dinner with them every evening. Mm-hmm. So they're physically sitting in front of you. You're having a conversation about what's going on in their life, and you're kind of, checking in on how they're feeling and what they're experiencing and what their challenges are. And I thought that was brilliant.
Yes.
And it shows that you care.
Right. And kids like that.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly had that as a family when I was growing up. I think when things changed, and here's the other element that I think is important. When I'm evaluating kids who are having challenges, or even adults later on in life, one of the things that I ask them is, what sort of outside school activities were you engaged in? Did you have a job? Were you on a sports team? Were you involved in any groups or organizations? Those kids who are involved in those kinds of activities grow to be much more resilient later in life. And because it's really those social connections. For me, I was a competitive swimmer. All my friends were on the swim team. We socialized together. We swam together. We worked out together. We spent a lot of time together growing up. And at that point, because of our practice requirements after school, we didn't have family dinners anymore. But by then, we had these social connections that were probably more important at that point, because kids don't want to be big adults. They want to be the alpha male or alpha female in their peer group. They're not interested in being, I think parents misinterpret their behaviors and their desires as wanting to be adult. That's not the case. They identify with their peers. They want the things their peers have. They associate with their peers' behaviors at that point more so than their parents. So their peers become their role models. So it's not really the parents' engagement and involvement is talking to the kids about the peers and helping shape the kids' peer group, not necessarily their behaviors.
So as our time together is coming to a close, what jewel of wisdom could you leave us with?
Jewel of wisdom. The solution to life is not offered in a prescription or a pill, that it requires a lot of different things to be engaged in. Most of the illnesses and diseases that we struggle with today, whether they're physical, emotional, cognitive, are the result of our environment. So they are what one physical anthropologist said were mismatched diseases. In other words, we evolved in a particular environment, which is why we have a particular set of interests, desires, appetites, and why we created this environment to basically satisfy all those. But unfortunately, because we now live in an abundance of those, we are developing diseases because we're getting too much of what we like.
Interesting.
And so the key is, kind of like the Buddha, everything in moderation. The key is understanding you do have a proclivity to want to like high-fat foods, to not want to exercise, to not want to socialize, but just be on social media because they feed those evolutionary appetites that evolved for us for survival value, but now work against us because they're a land of plenty. And now they're killing us. So it's a matter of understanding that those inclinations need to be resisted. And you do that by substituting those with other things. Most importantly, a social life, friends, family, loved ones. They are the protective factors, the most protective factors in your life. When they look at longevity and what keeps people alive, they talk about social connections. Mm-hmm. So it begs the question, well, what is a social connection? Well, actually, a social connection isn't what we think it is. We think it's, you have to have a large network of friends. No, you don't. You can have one or two close friends. It's ideally that feeling of loneliness or boredom that you need to resist. But more importantly, why is it important to get out? Having a social connection means just simply talking to the cash register when you're purchasing something. Hey, how's the weather? Or how much is this? Can I get some cash back? Those are the social connections that I'm talking about. They're very simple, but they're incredibly powerful, and we discount them. Having a cup of coffee, we talk about burnout in medicine, and we've tried to operationalize and eliminate any free activity thinking we need to be more productive. They don't realize that having a cup of coffee with a nurse and talking about your family and her family or his family is significant in terms of improving productivity and mental health and well-being than any other thing. When you start getting bean counters telling you you are wasting your time, they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Dr. Charles Herrick, thank you very much.
You're welcome.